The night was still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The moon hung low, its pale light slicing through the thick mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. In the heart of the cemetery, shadows danced among the tombstones, their shapes twisting and shifting as though alive. It was a place where whispers seemed to echo louder than words, where every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves felt like a secret being shared. And there he was, the cemetery keeper, a figure as enigmatic as the graves he tended. His presence was unsettling, his movements deliberate and slow, as if he carried the weight of countless untold stories on his shoulders. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones, their words laced with suspicion and fear. They said he knew things no living soul should know, that the dead whispered to him in the dead of night. But he never spoke of it, never let on what he truly knew. Tonight, as the mist grew thicker and the air turned colder, something stirred in the cemetery. Something that felt ancient, something that felt wrong. The cemetery keeper stood at the edge of it all, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he was waiting, biding his time. And as the first bell of midnight tolled, a chill ran through the air. Something unearthly was about to be revealed. Secrets long buried were about to come to light, and the truth, darker than the night itself, would finally be uncovered. Stay with us as we step into this world of shadows and whispers, where the line between the living and the dead is blurred, and the cemetery keeper's secret will be laid bare. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the cemetery keeper began his daily ritual, a routine as peculiar as the man himself. Each morning, he would emerge from his small, weathered cottage at the edge of the cemetery, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he carried the weight of centuries. His first task was always the same, a silent walk among the graves, his hands brushing lightly over the weathered tombstones, as if in silent conversation with those who lay beneath. It was said he spoke to them, not with words, but with a language only the dead could understand. The townsfolk watched him from a distance, their whispers growing louder with every passing day. They spoke of how he lingered too long at certain graves, his gaze intense, as if listening to secrets the rest of the world could never hear. Some claimed he left offerings, strange, unidentifiable objects, at the base of the stones. Others swore they saw him kneel in the dirt, his lips moving in silent prayer, though no one could say to whom or what he prayed. Rumors swirled like the mist that clung to the cemetery grounds. They said he knew things no living soul should know. How could he, they wondered, tend to the dead with such precision, as if he could read their final wishes etched into the earth itself? Some even believed he could summon them, that the dead rose at his command, though such tales were dismissed as the ramblings of superstitious minds. Yet for all the speculation, the cemetery keeper remained an enigma. He never spoke of his work, never explained the strange rituals that defined his days. He simply moved through the cemetery like a shadow, his presence both unnerving and strangely comforting. And as the sun set each evening, he would disappear into his cottage, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the townsfolk to wonder what he did in the darkness, when the living world slept and the dead were left to roam. The more they watched, the more they questioned. What drew him to this place of eternal rest? What secrets did he share with the silent inhabitants of the graves? And why, despite their fear, did they feel compelled to keep their distance, as if an unseen force warned them not to interfere? The cemetery keeper's arrival every morning was not just a routine, it was a mystery, one that deepened with every passing day, leaving the townsfolk to wonder if they truly wanted to know the answers. But as the days turned to weeks, something began to change in the cemetery. It started with the faintest of whispers, carried on the wind late at night, when the moon hung low and the shadows stretched long. On one such night, a grave near the edge of the plot appeared disturbed, the earth freshly turned as if something had clawed its way out, or been pulled from below. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered, their voices hushed but eyes wide with fear. Yet, when the cemetery keeper arrived, he barely glanced at the disturbed ground. Instead, he knelt, smoothed the earth with his hands, and walked away as if nothing had happened. Then came the sightings. A figure, pale and translucent, was seen gliding between the tombstones in the dead of night, its form flickering like a dying candle flame. Those who dared watch from their windows swore it paused at certain graves, as if searching for something or someone. The townsfolk trembled, their whispers now filled with dread. But the cemetery keeper seemed unbothered. When confronted, he simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and returned to his work. It was as if he expected these things, as if the supernatural was just another part of his routine. The more the townsfolk observed, the more they realized he wasn't afraid. In fact, he seemed to welcome the disturbances, his presence calming the restless energy that now permeated the cemetery. Could it be, they wondered, that he was not just a keeper of the dead, but also a guardian of something far more ancient, far more dangerous? As the strange occurrences grew more frequent, the line between the living and the dead began to blur. The cemetery keeper's calm demeanor only deepened the mystery, leaving the townsfolk to question what else lay hidden beneath the earth, and what role he played in the unearthly truths that were now impossible to ignore. As the townsfolk's unease grew, curiosity began to outweigh their fear. One evening, under the cover of darkness, a young man named Thomas ventured into the cemetery keeper's cottage. The air inside was heavy with the scent of aged wood and candle wax, and the flickering light of a single lantern cast long shadows across the room. Among the clutter of tools and trinkets, Thomas's eyes fell on an old, weathered journal tucked away on a shelf. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages yellowed with age, but it seemed to call to him, as if it held the answers to the mysteries that had consumed the town. He opened it cautiously, the spine creaking as if protesting the intrusion. The pages were filled with cramped, uneven handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The entries spoke of the dead, not just names and dates, but intimate details of their lives, their regrets, and their secrets. Yet, among these records were cryptic notes that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Phrases like, "The veil grows thin," and "The cycle must continue," appeared repeatedly, alongside diagrams of strange symbols and instructions for a ritual described only as forbidden. One passage stood out, written in a shaky hand. "They are not truly gone. They linger, waiting for the call. The keeper must ensure the balance, lest the dead rise in chaos." The words seemed to confirm the townsfolk's suspicions. The cemetery keeper was no mere caretaker. He was a guardian of something far older and more perilous than they could imagine. Thomas flipped through the journal with growing dread, his hands trembling. The final pages contained a warning. "Beware the midnight hour, for that is when the line between worlds dissolves. The keeper must perform the ritual, or all shall be lost." He slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding. What had he stumbled upon, And what would happen if the ritual failed? The journal's secrets hinted at a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. It was clear now. The cemetery keeper's role was not just to tend to the dead, but to keep something far more sinister at bay. As Thomas slipped out of the cottage, he couldn't shake the feeling that the keeper's secret was no longer his alone, and that the town's fate now hung in the balance. As the clock inched closer to midnight, the cemetery seemed to hold its breath. Thomas, hidden behind a weathered tombstone, watched as the cemetery keeper emerged from the shadows. The man moved with purpose, carrying a bag that clinked faintly with every step. The air grew colder, and a thick mist began to creep across the ground, swallowing the edges of the graveyard. The keeper stopped in the center of the cemetery, where a circle of stones had been arranged with meticulous care. From his bag, he pulled out a vial of dark liquid and began drawing symbols on the ground, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe in the dim moonlight. Each stroke of the brush sent a faint hum through the air, as if the earth itself was responding to his touch. As the final symbol was completed, the keeper stepped into the circle and raised his arms, his voice low and guttural as he began to chant. The words were foreign, ancient, and carried a weight that made Thomas's skin crawl. The mist thickened, swirling around the circle like a living thing, and the symbols on the ground began to glow with an eerie, pale light. A low rumble shook the ground, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Thomas clung to the tombstone, his heart racing as he realized what he was witnessing. This was no ordinary ritual. It was a summoning. The keeper's voice grew louder, more urgent, and the symbols pulsed in time with his chants. From the mist, a shadow began to form, a figure tall and indistinct, its presence radiating a cold, otherworldly power. The keeper's chant reached a crescendo, and the figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. Thomas could barely breathe. What had the keeper summoned? And what did it want? The keeper lowered his arms, his voice fading into silence. The figure lingered for a moment, as if waiting for something, before dissolving back into the mist. The symbols on the ground dimmed, and the air grew still once more. The keeper stood motionless, his face unreadable, before gathering his tools and disappearing into the night. Thomas remained hidden, his mind racing. He had seen something that defied explanation, something that made the journal's warnings all too real. The keeper's ritual was not just a secret, it was a desperate act to maintain a fragile balance. But what would happen if that balance was broken? The question lingered in the air, as heavy and unspoken as the mist that now blanketed the cemetery. As the mist began to thin, Thomas noticed a faint glow emanating from the far corner of the cemetery. His eyes strained to make out the source, and then he saw it. A figure, translucent and ethereal, drifting silently among the tombstones. The ghostly apparition was clad in tattered garments, its face pale and sorrowful, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of pain. Every movement it made was smooth, almost fluid, as if it were gliding rather than walking. The figure paused, turning its gaze directly toward Thomas. A cold shiver ran down his spine as their eyes met. Though it spoke no words, a voice echoed in Thomas's mind, faint but unmistakable. "He cannot keep us here forever," it whispered, its tone filled with a mix of anger and despair. The message was cryptic, but the weight of it was undeniable. The cemetery keeper, who had been lingering in the shadows, stepped forward. His expression was a mix of caution and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. He raised a hand toward the ghostly figure, not in a gesture of defiance, but one of acknowledgement. "You know the bargain," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange mixture of authority and regret. The apparition's form flickered, its glow dimming as if the keeper's words had struck a chord. For a moment, it seemed as though it might vanish entirely, but then it spoke again, its voice now filled with a quiet resolve. "The balance is slipping," it warned. "You must act before it's too late." The keeper's face darkened, and he nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting this. He turned away, his shoulders heavy, and began to retreat into the shadows once more. The ghostly figure lingered for a moment longer, its gaze lingering on Thomas before it dissolved into the mist, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence. Thomas stood frozen, his mind racing. The encounter had revealed a connection between the keeper and the spirits of the cemetery, one that was far deeper and more complicated than he had imagined. What was the bargain the keeper had spoken of, and what did the ghost mean by the balance slipping? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The keeper's ritual was no longer just a mystery. It was a desperate attempt to maintain a fragile equilibrium. And as Thomas watched the mist settle once more over the graveyard, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far darker. The night had revealed a truth that was both haunting and inescapable, and Thomas knew there was no turning back. As the eerie silence of the cemetery draped itself over the landscape once more, Thomas felt an inexplicable pull toward the oldest part of the grounds. The air grew heavier with each step, and the moonlight seemed to dim as he approached a section of the cemetery he had never noticed before. There, half buried beneath a tangle of ivy and moss, stood a tomb unlike any other. The structure was ancient, its stones weathered and cracked, yet it radiated an unnatural sense of permanence. Strange markings covered its surface, symbols etched into the stone that seemed to writhe and shift when Thomas looked at them too long. They were neither letters nor any language he recognized, but they carried an unmistakable weight, as if they held a power that transcended mere words. A cold wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the tomb itself. It was a sound that burrowed into Thomas's mind, filling him with a sense of dread so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He could feel the tomb's presence, as though it were alive, watching him, waiting. The keeper appeared suddenly, his figure emerging from the shadows like a spectre. His eyes were fixed on the tomb, and for the first time, Thomas saw fear in them, a raw, unguarded fear that sent a chill through his very core. "You shouldn't be here," the keeper said, his voice low and strained. "This is not a place for the living." But Thomas couldn't look away. The tomb seemed to call to him, whispering secrets that were just out of reach. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice trembling. The keeper hesitated, his gaze lingering on the strange markings. "This tomb holds the truth," he said finally, his tone heavy with resignation. "But it's a truth that should never be uncovered. The balance I spoke of, it's tied to this place. If it's disturbed, the consequences will be unimaginable." Thomas felt the weight of the keeper's words settle over him. The tomb wasn't just a burial place. It was a keystone, something vital to the delicate equilibrium the keeper had been desperately trying to maintain. But what was hidden inside, and why was the keeper so determined to keep it sealed? As he stood there, the hum from the tomb grew louder, almost deafening, and the markings on the stone seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. Thomas knew one thing for certain: this tomb was the key to unraveling the keeper's secret. but opening it could unleash something far darker than he could ever imagine. The night had only just begun to reveal its horrors, and the tomb promised truths that would change everything. As the tension in the air thickened, Thomas took a step closer to the keeper, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "You can't keep hiding the truth. Whatever's in that tomb, it's tied to everything happening here. Tell me what you know." The keeper's gaze shifted, his eyes dark with years of burden. He hesitated, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him like the ancient stones of the cemetery. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The tomb, it's not just a resting place. It's a prison for something that should never see the light of day." Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean, a prison? What's inside?" The keeper's hands trembled as he gestured to the strange markings. "These symbols, they're not just carvings. They're a seal, a binding. I've spent my life making sure it stays intact. But the forces at work here, they're growing stronger. The dead are restless, and the veil between worlds is thinning." "What are you trying to say?" Thomas pressed, his heart pounding. The keeper's voice dropped lower, as if even speaking the words could risk awakening whatever lay within. "Long ago, this place was a gateway, a passage between the living and the other side. Those who came before me, they made a pact to keep it closed. They trapped something here, something ancient, something malevolent. And I'm the last in a long line of caretakers tasked with keeping it bound." Thomas stared at him, the implications sinking in. "So all the strange things happening, the graves, the whispers, the apparitions, it's all connected to this?" The keeper nodded, his expression grim. "Every disturbance, every unnatural event, it's a sign that the seal is weakening, and if it breaks..." He trailed off, his silence speaking volumes. Thomas's mind raced. He thought of the humming, the pulsing light from the tomb, the dread that seemed to emanate from it. If it breaks, what happens? The keeper looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "If it breaks, the world as we know it will end, and I won't be able to stop it." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Thomas felt the enormity of the keeper's burden, the decades of silent guardianship, the fear of failure that must have haunted him every day. But even as the confession left him with more questions than answers, one thing was clear. The tomb wasn't just a mystery to be solved. It was a ticking time bomb, and the keeper's secret was the only thing keeping it from exploding. The night felt darker now, the shadows deeper, the air colder. Thomas knew that whatever lay ahead, the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The keeper's confession was just the beginning, and the truth it hinted at was far more terrifying than he could have ever prepared for. As the weight of the keeper's confession settled over them, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an unspoken dread. The keeper took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he began to unravel the unearthly truth. "The ritual I perform every midnight," he started, "it's not just a tradition. It's a binding incantation, passed down through generations of caretakers. Its purpose is to reinforce the seal on the tomb, to keep what's inside from escaping." Thomas's eyes narrowed, his voice barely audible. "What exactly is inside?" The keeper's gaze drifted to the tomb, his expression haunted. "An entity," he whispered. "A being of pure malevolence, older than time itself. It's not just a spirit or a ghost, it's something far worse. Something that craves destruction, that feeds on fear and despair. The ones who came before me called it the Devourer." Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. And you've been communicating with it. The keeper nodded slowly, his face pale. The ritual requires a sacrifice not of blood, but of energy. Every night, I channel my own life force into the seal, using it as a barrier to keep the Devourer contained. But it's been growing stronger, more restless. It whispers to me, tries to corrupt my thoughts, my will. It wants out, and it's using the disturbances in the cemetery to weaken the seal. Thomas's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what he'd witnessed. The graves being disturbed, the apparitions, the humming, it's all the Devourer's doing. It's trying to break free. Yes, the keeper said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. And every time I perform the ritual, it takes a little more from me. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold it back. The implications were staggering. Thomas stared at the keeper, realization dawning. If the seal breaks, the Devourer escapes. And if it does, it won't just be this cemetery that suffers. The keeper interrupted, his tone grim. It will spread, consuming everything in its path. The dead will rise, the living will fall, and the world will be plunged into chaos. That's why I've kept this secret, why I've shouldered this burden alone. Because if people knew the truth, they'd try to interfere, and that would only hasten its release. Thomas felt a surge of urgency. There has to be another way. We can't just let this happen. The keeper shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. There's no other way. The seal was created by those who came before me, and its power is tied to the ritual. If I fail, if the seal breaks, there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. The Devourer will be free, and the world as we know it will end. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, the enormity of the keeper's role now fully revealed. He wasn't just a caretaker of graves. He was a guardian of the living world, standing between humanity and an unimaginable horror. And as Thomas looked into the keeper's weary eyes, he realized the man's greatest fear wasn't just the Devourer's escape. It was the knowledge that he might not be strong enough to stop it. The night seemed to grow darker, the shadows closing in as the truth sank in. The keeper's secret wasn't just a mystery, it was a doomsday clock, ticking ever closer to midnight. As the weight of the keeper's confession lingered in the air, the tension in the cemetery reached its peak. Thomas, now fully aware of the grave danger, stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We can't just stand here and wait for this to unfold. There has to be something we can do to stop it. The keeper's eyes flashed with a mix of fear and determination. You don't understand. The ritual is the only thing keeping the Devourer contained. If I falter, if even a single word is mispronounced, it could break free. You're playing with forces you can't comprehend. Before Thomas could respond, the ground beneath them trembled violently. A low, guttural growl echoed from the direction of the tomb, sending shivers down their spines. The air grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. From the depths of the tomb, a faint, otherworldly light began to seep through the cracks in the stone. The keeper's hands trembled as he clutched the ancient journal to his chest. It's waking up. The seal is weakening faster than I anticipated. Thomas stepped closer, his voice firm. Then let us help you. You've been doing this alone for too long. We can share the burden, strengthen the ritual together. The keeper hesitated, his eyes darting between Thomas and the tomb. You don't know what you're asking. The ritual demands a price, one that could cost you your sanity, your very soul. Before the keeper could protest further, the light from the tomb intensified, and a deafening roar erupted, shaking the ground like an earthquake. The tombstone lid cracked open, and a cloud of black smoke billowed out, taking on a grotesque, shifting form. The Devourer had awakened. The keeper's face paled, but he stood his ground, his voice trembling as he began the incantation. Thomas, sensing the gravity of the moment, joined him, repeating the words as best he could. The air around them crackled with energy, and a faint golden glow began to emanate from the keeper's hands, weaving into the air like threads of light. The Devourer roared again, its form solidifying into a monstrous figure with glowing red eyes and jagged, shadowy claws. It lunged toward them, but the golden threads of light formed a barrier, holding it at bay. The keeper's voice grew stronger, more desperate, as he poured every ounce of his strength into the ritual. But the Devourer was relentless. It swiped at the barrier, each strike sending shockwaves through the air. The keeper stumbled, his strength waning. "I can't hold it much longer," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on the keeper's shoulder. "We're in this together. Don't give up now." With newfound determination, the keeper redoubled his efforts, and the barrier of light grew brighter, pushing the Devourer back toward the tomb. The entity let out a final, ear-splitting scream as it was forced into the darkness, the tomb's lid slamming shut with a resounding thud. The silence that followed was deafening. The keeper collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. Thomas stood beside him, breathing heavily, his mind reeling from the enormity of what they had just faced. The keeper looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's done, for now, but the Devourer will return. It's only a matter of time." Thomas nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to end this once and for all." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the cemetery seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But the unearthly truth they had uncovered lingered in the air, a grim reminder that their battle was far from over. The final confrontation had ended, but the war against the Devourer had only just begun. As the dust settled and the first rays of dawn painted the cemetery in a pale, ghostly light, the air felt heavier than before. The once quiet tombstones now seemed to hum with a faint, unnatural resonance, as if the very ground had absorbed the chaos of the night. The keeper, still kneeling on the cold earth, clutched the ancient journal to his chest, his hands trembling not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he had unleashed, and what he had managed to contain for now. The cemetery itself had changed. The paths, once neatly lined with gravel, were now scattered with debris, and the shadows seemed deeper, more alive, twisting and shifting, as if they held secrets of their own. The trees, their branches clawing at the sky, seemed to lean closer, as though whispering warnings to anyone who dared to listen. Even the air smelled different, acrid and metallic, like the aftermath of a storm that never truly passed. The keeper's face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if the ritual had drained more than just his strength. He looked up at Thomas, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not over, it's never over. The Devourer is bound, but it's still there, waiting, watching. The cemetery, it's alive now. It's a part of it." Thomas glanced around, his unease growing with every word. The silence was unnatural, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant, echoing hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. The keeper shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I've spent years trying to keep it contained, but each time it gets stronger. The ritual, it's not enough anymore. It's only a matter of time before it breaks free again. As they stood there, the subtle shifts in the cemetery became impossible to ignore. The ground beneath their feet felt warmer, almost pulsating, and the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. The keeper's cottage, once a refuge, now loomed like a shadow, its windows dark and lifeless, as if the building itself had turned against him. Thomas placed a hand on the keeper's shoulder, his grip firm. "We'll find a way. Whatever it takes, we'll stop this. But you can't do it alone anymore. You've been carrying this burden too long." The keeper nodded, but his eyes were distant, filled with a quiet resignation. "Maybe, but the price, it's more than you can imagine. The Devourer doesn't just take lives. It takes pieces of you, fragments of your soul. It leaves you hollow, a shell of who you once were." As the sun climbed higher, the cemetery's unnatural quiet persisted, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. The keeper rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every step required immense effort. He turned to Thomas, his voice low but filled with a grim determination. "Go rest. We'll need all the strength we can muster for what's to come." Thomas hesitated, his gaze lingering on the tomb, now sealed but still radiating a faint, ominous energy. "And what about you?" The keeper's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "I'll stay. The cemetery needs me now more than ever. The Devourer may be bound, but it's still here, and I can't leave it unattended." "Not again." As Thomas walked away, the keeper stood alone amidst the tombstones, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. The cemetery seemed to watch him, the shadows stretching long and thin, as if reaching out to claim him once more. The air was thick with the weight of the unearthly truth they had uncovered, a truth that left more questions than answers. And as the morning light bathed the cemetery in its glow, the sense of unease lingered, a chilling reminder that the battle against the Devourer was far from over. The keeper's secret had been revealed, but the horrors it held were only just beginning to unfold. As the morning sun cast its light over the cemetery, the revelations of the night remained etched in the air like a haunting echo. The keeper, a man once shrouded in mystery, had unveiled a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. His fight against the Devourer, a force beyond comprehension, was a stark reminder of the thin veil between life and death, the seen and the unseen. The cemetery itself had become something more, a living, breathing entity tied to the Devourer's presence. Its shadows whispered secrets, its ground pulsed with an unnatural energy, and its silence spoke louder than any scream. The keeper's life, once devoted to tending the dead, had transformed into a battle against an ancient evil that threatened to consume everything in its path. Thomas, now burdened with the knowledge of the Devourer, stood at the edge of a choice, whether to walk away or to join the keeper in a fight that could cost him his very soul. The keeper's warning lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder of the price that comes with facing the darkness head-on. As the story unfolds, it leaves us with questions that linger long after the final word is spoken. What does it mean to stand against forces beyond our understanding? How far would we go to protect those we care about, even if it means sacrificing pieces of ourselves? And in the face of the unknown, can we truly conquer the darkness, or are we merely delaying the inevitable? The cemetery keeper's secret is a testament to the fragility of life, the weight of secrets, and the enduring power of the supernatural. It challenges us to confront our own fears, to question what lies beyond the veil, and to consider the cost of standing against the unearthly. Now, as the story fades into the morning light, we're left to wonder what other secrets lie hidden in the shadows. What truths are waiting to be uncovered, and are we ready to face them? The cemetery stands as a silent witness, its stories untold, its mysteries waiting to be discovered. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey into the cemetery keeper's secret. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales of mystery and the supernatural. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive, and remember, sometimes the most chilling truths are the ones we least expect to find.